language is, maybe, the most important thing in any culture. You know that the language is not only a tool of communication, it's a manner of thinking. It shows the way in we see the world. So, we have a great challenge here to talk about Latin American culture and the colonial option in English. Well, in the studies that are dedicated to investigate the Latin American culture, it's very necessary to start to rethink some concepts that are paradigmatic, as hybridization, border, multiculturalism, etc., and some risky dichotomies, such as civilization and barbarity, very classic, center and periphery, colonialism and post-colonialism, etc. I'd like to talk then about two Latin America projects in which I am participating now that are working on those ideas. The first one belongs to Ediciones del Signo, a little Argentine independent editorial that has a collection called El Desprendimiento, The Landslide, managed by two Argentine researchers, Zulma Palermo from Universidad Nacional de Salta in the north of Argentina, and Walter Mignolo from Duke University in the United States. And the second project that I manage at El Salvador University is Escrituras Fronterizas de la Literatura Argentina, Border Writings of Argentine Literature. From the philosophy and the art, especially the literature, these two projects try to think from, over, and about Latin America. This point of view requires to change the position from which we are thinking about ourselves and we see the world. Therefore, our two projects are thought from a border position. It's a position from we can discuss the dichotomies, center and periphery, civilization and barbarity, our own culture and the external one, male and female, etc. It's a position that is between these opposite terms, that participates of both, not being one, and at the same time being both. A position from which we avoid to get caught in an absolute concept, a concept that makes incompatible some significant differences. We are studying these ways of thinking through the Latin American art and essays, but the point is that we are conscious that the categories we use have been imposed by colonialist cultures. The question is, then, are there other ones? Let me give you an example. There are writings like Mi tío el jaguarete, My uncle the jaguar, by João Guimarães Rosa, a Brazilian author, that make us think in a different manner, because it shows a nature that is not a landscape where human beings, animals, and jungle are connected. The victim hands itself, himself or herself, to keep the life of the unit. Every food is anthropophagic because there is only one life that requires devouring to go on. How can we think this reality with those binary categories? categories as civilization and barbarity, nature versus human being, don't work in text like this because there are not opposite terms here. There is only one body that goes on in several corporal forms. Evidently, other manner of thinking prevails. So, from the old peripheral countries, researches like that emerge. I mean, researches that try to think other categories, because those categories don't allow other ways of thinking and living that are different from the colonialist point of view considers appropriate. In Latin America, these researches go back to 15th century. There are a lot of documents that register the problem of the difference and distance between both cultures, the colonialist and the colonized one. The difference defines the rules of superiority and inferiority between cultures, and the distance shows how far the power center is and emphasizes the dichotomy, this very problematic and questionable dichotomy, development and backwardness. To accomplish its objective, the colonialist culture had to deny all pre-existing life and production's ways in order to erase the roots of learning manners, techniques transmission, and the use of own local materials, and had to deny to replace them for point of view instruments and materials from its superior civilization. So, from the beginning, that dichotomy, superiority and inferiority, will govern the aesthetic criteria. According to Zulma Palermo, to dismiss the production of pre-existing cultures considered only autochthonous, it means inferior to universal and canonized work of arts. It's the cornerstone of the colonialism, and is doing so to convince others that goodness, truth, and beauty are in another place. What does it mean? In Argentina, for a long time, when an artist wanted to improve his work, he traveled to Europe, to Paris or to Rome, to learn from the masters. Why? Because he thought that in Latin America he only could learn craftworks techniques or primitive techniques, but it didn't happen. It didn't happen only in Latin America. Let me show you another example on the other side. It's a little funny. Do you remember the famous movie Titanic? In this movie, Leonardo DiCaprio wins a ticket to the ship in the cards game, but he's late because the Titanic is departing when he arrives, and he can pass the medical revision. When the security guards try to stop him, he shouts, "I'm an American," and the guards automatically let him pass. Because in America, it means in the United States, people are never sick, of course. They never have lysis, for example. How the colonialist culture manages to convince us of this? I think that through teaching and art, among other ways, of course. But in my examples, a colonialist teacher who believes to know the truth teaches that the beauty's ideal is, for example, a sculpture by Michelangelo, the David. And the movie, like Titanic, shows that the American people are healthy, while European people are not because of the poverty. The point is, in America, of course, they aren't poor because America is the land of opportunities. And if we want to be part of that, we have to go to America. Again, the goodness is in another place. The first step would be to get the colonialist categories away because they play in the center of the issue actual and questionable differences, like, for example, art versus craft work. The name of the sculpture on the left is Cabeza, by a head, by Fernando Botero, a very famous Colombian artist. And on the right, a good example of Peruvian art, considered craft works, of course. What's the difference between them? According to the colonialist vision, the artworks are produced to aesthetic pleasure, and the craft work can be used in everyday life, maybe as ornament above the fireplace, I don't know. The artist is a human being who is different from others because he distinguishes himself creating a unique work, while the craftsman is an anonymous one who produces works in large quantities. Therefore, he disappears behind these works because under the colonialist vision, he doesn't create anything. We can see that the concept of creation is very important and peculiar in this topic. I mean, the artwork is considered unique, while the craft work can be replaced. The real aesthetic pleasure is something more abstract and superior because it's produced by a special human being, a creator of the real beauty. The craft work can be beautiful but not unique. So, when we talk about art, we use acquired knowledge, languages, and techniques. We wonder if there are other expressions to our unsubjectivity. We wonder if there is an aesthetic that shapes an ethic of the difference. The critical Latin American thought is looking for other ways of expression, such as other languages and techniques, since the American Baroque period. In the last century, with several paradigmatic ideas like anthropophagy, transculturation, hybridization, etc. The first one, anthropophagy, in 1928, the Brazilian thinker Oswald de Andrade published an anthropophagy manifest. In this, he proposed that the Brazilian culture has to transform, to digest everything that comes from European models, to reach a unique and autochthonous Brazilian art. This is the meaning of anthropophagy in this concept. Transculturation is a concept that was proposed by the Cuban anthropologist Fernando Ortiz in 1940. His president, of course, was José Martí. Transculturation supposes, in this perspective, that it's very difficult when a culture receives another one, it can be lived without conflict, because always all of them considers itself more advanced and tries to impose onto the other one. And hybridization was proposed by the Argentine anthropologist Néstor García Canclini in 1990. From this perspective, hybridization is a difficult term that supposes a kind of mixture with a result that is not homogeneous. It's made of different characteristics and identities, but the focus is on the difference, not on the equality. Hybridization doesn't mean changing a culture for another one, but to transform them in something new. In the whole world, the colonialism of thinking is improving by different ways of thinking or manners. If we could think with other categories, not looking for a new equality, maybe we could see and include those differences. We could include other subjectivities that cannot be in these homogeneous identities that the colonialist cultures pretend. I'm sorry, it's a very, very short summary. There are thousands of papers about this topic, and you know them, sure. But based on this concept and others, we try to think the Latin American reality. The landslide, El Desprendimiento, compiles papers by Latin American essayists who try to refuse the ways of knowledge that have dominated our thinking and have shaped our subjectivity. You know that the modernity's narrative of development motivates the consumption and makes an effort to keep the idea that there is only one history. For that, the purpose of this narrative is the perpetuation of subjectivities that are consumption devotees, whose unique liberty consists on choosing compulsorily leaders who claim that only when we accumulate wealth, merchandises, and properties, we will be able to have a moral and successful life. According to Walter Mignolo, the modernity produces then colonial, patriarchal, and racist wounds. The only way to heal these wounds is to detach from ourselves of the modernity rules and hierarchies, to learn to unlearn, to learn again in another way. In Latin America, the Peruvian sociologist and political scientist Aníbal Quijano has consolidated the trilogy Modernity, Colonialism, and Decolonial Option. The last one, proposes to deny the colonialism, its matrix of power, to learn to think in another manner. According to him, to recognize that the exploitation of the reason by the colonial matrix of power produced knowledge paradigms that spoiled the liberating promises of the modernity. Therefore, colonialism and biopower became two essential concepts in the 20th century. The first one, the colonialism, appeared from the debates and conflicts of the local history in Latin America, and to think about this, its implications, and of course the decolonial option, it's very important to begin with the Peruvian José Mariátegui's works, 7 essays of interpretation of the Peruvian reality, and with the ideas from the theology of liberation. You know that the second one is a Christian movement, Catholic and Protestant, that was born in Latin America after the Second Vatican Council and the Medellin Conference in 1968. The first works were written by the Brazilian educator and Presbyterian ex-pastor Rubén Alves and the Peruvian Catholic priest Gustavo Gutiérrez Merino. The second concept, the biopower that Michel Foucault coined in the first volume of The History of Sexuality, called The Wheel of Knowledge, appear from the debates and conflict of the local history in Western Europe. So, both histories, Latin American and West European, have been connected for centuries by power relationship. Now, in this editorial project, The Landslide, we are working about the impact of the popular rebellion in Canudos between 1896 and 1897 in Latin American history and art. Canudos is a little village in the north of Brazil, in Salvador Bahia state. The leader of this rebellion was Antonio Vicente Méndez Maciel, called the Chancellor, and they rebelled in face of the landowner injustice and the state control. This situation impacted in the Latin American art and thinking, especially in the literature and the cinema. In our group, Maria Piaz Lopez is working about the chronicle by Euclides da Cunha, or Sertoes, published in 1902. I don't know, but there is no word to translate that. I think a sertón is an arid zone in the northeast of Brazil. I am writing about the sixth novel by Mario Vargas Llosa, The World of the End of the World, published in 1981. Nicolás Fernández Muriano is working about the movie God and the Devil in the Land of the Sun, released in 1964 by Glauber Rocha, a very famous director of the Brazilian new cinema. And Horacio González is analyzing the relationship between art and nation in apocalyptic stories in Latin America. I'm going to talk about my work briefly, don't worry, to show you the relation between this topic, with this topic. I compare the interpretation of the Vargas Llosa novels from several researchers, like the British professor Donald Shaw and the Uruguayan essayist Angel Rama, among others. And it's very interesting because in these interpretations, it's possible to see the different point of view from different cultural categories. For example, Donald Shaw, the first one, Donald Shaw, thinking from the dichotomy civilization and barbarity, claims that the author, Vargas Llosa, shows the fanatism and violence as essential characteristics of the Latin American people, while Angel Rama analyzes the narrator, who builds a system of oppositions among characters that are very successful to the realist neutrality in their treatment. According to Rama, this fluctuating perspective allows plural readings because the Latin American historical new fiction questions that the reality is intelligible according to positivist categories. What I want to mean is that we can see two alternatives to understand the reality and the fiction. The first one is produced by a dichotomous thinking. There is a culture immersed in fanatism and violence, therefore primitive, that supposes a colonized one, a civilized one. And a second thinking focus on the possibility of different interpretation of the world and reality and ways to understand this reality. In this project, we think that to avoid this kind of thinking that is based on binary categories, it's very important to live and think from the border. What does it mean? I like to answer this question talking about the second project that I manage at El Salvador University. This is our website in Cervantes Virtual platform. Of course, nowadays, and it is very, very important, the relationship between colonialism and the colonial option is not an issue of geographical borders, but a perspective one. Bearing in mind the concept of writing, the phrase border writings can be thought connected to the limit considered a textual matrix, whether geographical, political, social, economic, or the sex-gender system, but always labile and every time more difficult to identify in specific terms. A very interesting approach to this matter is one expressed in Mesandra's and Nelson's book, Border as Method or Multiplication of Labor, following Balaibar's idea of the multiplicity and polysemy of the border. The authors focus not on an object seen from a certain notion of border, but the border as the methodology with which we analyzed the object. This is the point. In the Argentine literature, the concept of border is an object of interest for writers, researchers, and thinkers of different disciplines, and especially in literature, according to the Argentine professor Eve Clementi, in the border in the American continent. It becomes a topic that enlightens personal and collective identity problems. Therefore, in our literature, the border is a discursive stage where the landscape becomes an ideology. We study novels from the 19th century to the 21st century because it is not a new problem in our literature. Let me show you some examples. In the 19th century, Una excursión a los indios ranqueles, an excursion to the Ranqueles Indígenas, published in 1870 by Lucio Mansilla, emerges as a very different point of view about the dichotomy civilization and barbarity, presenting the aboriginal inhabitant of Argentina as cultural subject. Another paradigmatic example is Facundo, published in 1845 by Domingo Faustino Sarmiento. This author shows the Argentine desert not as an empty place, but as a paradoxical matrix of poetry, and somehow as a model of the Argentine identity. What about the 20th century? Different proposals like this appear. Through long centuries on Western history, clothes and ornament considered in their hegemonic and patriarchal sense, which means that they are used to seduce men, increase competition among women, or silence them, have turned their bodies into a significant locus able to embody and transmit cultural rules that have reinforced gender binary boundaries. In Río de las Congojas, River of the Anguishes, the Argentine author Libertad Dimitropoulos creates a new poetic about clothes and ornament that overthrows identity and genetic differences and consequently allows women to achieve a political position to struggle against an oppressive male chauvinist system. Therefore, the novel makes problematic the gap between the feminine and the masculine. By doing so, the border acquires a labile and unstable character. Even though the frontier is generally thought as a line, something like a geographical limit, but this condition involves also other connotations. I mean dimensions related to the social classes and even races. These situations occur in Argentina in places where marginal people live, called villas, slums. They also exist in other Latin American countries under different names such as cantegriles, favelas, comunas, etc. Slums can be inside the cities or at the border of them, but usually there is some kind of physical limit between the ones and the others. A wall, a gate, a street, I don't know. These ways of life induces different cultural and ethnical behaviors and specific behaviors and strategies which can provoke reciprocal resistances or, on the other way round, certain dynamic contacts. This topic is especially treated by novels which are being written in our literature, like Islam is Also the American Continent by Bernardo Berbisky, or For a Lifetime by Juan Martini. But in Argentine literature from the 21st century, bordering characters and narrators appear and show that as they have a frontier inside themselves, it's necessary to change the epistemological coordinates. We can find a blurred nature of this border between a member of the hegemonic power and a marginal one. So, a third space appears. It's a space that resists to be physically located. It's labile, ambiguous, and moving. It's a paradoxical and interstitial concept that sentences the character to be itself another at the same time. You surely remember the Julia Kristeva's proposal, don't you? An stranger for ourselves. We can observe this, for example, in novels like Dark Monotonous Blood by Sergio Holguín or Criminal Tango by Álvaro Abós. These novels show characters that have a double life. They move around the city and the slum. They have relationships in both places, and they are always breaking the limits. But these kind of characters are in a place where they don't reach the equality by neutralization of the difference, but emphasizing the relational aspect between the differences. Hannah Arendt in The Human Condition called it interest. It is a controversial space that redeveloped the concept of the unit because in this the equality and the difference live together. A place like that makes us rethink the border as a dividing line between opposite terms and the identity as something homogeneous. I want to finish my speech emphasizing that nowadays we have to understand that it's necessary to change the premises of thought. The colonialism of thinking taught us that there is only one discourse to explain the history, a discourse that describes the world through binary categories and establishes hierarchies among races, social classes, sexualities, etc., in order to reach homogeneous identities, that are very easy to control, of course. The most terrible consequence is that a lot of people, the others, can be reading for those categories, therefore are excluded. This subjectivity, although they are uncomfortable to the matrix of power, exist, and we can't continue ignoring them. And a detail that is not innocuous, all the countries, not only the third world countries, are victims of this colonialism, not only of the bodies, but also of the thought. Thank you very much.